See, go back to Nietzsche for a second, because I want to ask you about that. My conviction is atheists, both old and new, so the Hitchens and Dawkins, Sam Harris today, but then go back to the Feuerbachs and Nietzsche's and company, that they're rebelling quite properly against a false God, what I would characterize as a false God. The God who is posing a threat to our freedom, the God who broods over us in this moralizing and dehumanizing way, the God who I would say is a supreme being among other beings, all of that. I applaud them. I mean, the atheists, old and new, are rebelling against that. But it's partially because I think Jung saw this in his own father, right, who was a Calvinist minister, that we got so bad at proclaiming the true God, who is not brooding over our freedom in this sort of moralizing and oppressive way, who's not competing with our flourishing, but the glory of God's a human being fully alive, says Irenaeus. That's the biblical idea. Or the burning bush, the fathers love that, is the bush that's on fire but not consumed. Well, that's the way the true God relates to creation. He makes it beautiful and radiant, but doesn't burn it up. Or like in so many of the Greek and Roman myths, when the gods break in, things have to give way, or they're incinerated, or they're destroyed. But the Bible presents this very unique and humanizing view of God, and then culminating in the incarnation. So God becomes one of us without. That's why it's so beautiful to me in those seemingly abstract formulas about the two natures that come together in Jesus without mixing, mingling, and confusion. And you say, well, that's a lot of these Greek abstractions, but no, that's very powerful. That God and humanity can meet in such a way that humanity is not overwhelmed and destroyed. See, but that's what the atheists, quite rightly, old and new, are objecting to, is precisely that false understanding of God. But
I've always thought of Nietzsche it's a very disturbing analogy, but I've always thought of Nietzsche playing the same role as maggots do when cleaning out a wound.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not. Yeah. He's a very sophisticated thinker, and to think of Nietzsche simply as an atheist, I think is a terrible mistake. I mean, he certainly had plenty of good things to say about Catholicism, about the fact that Catholicism was an anti-diabolical movement that united Europe.
Right.
Under the rubric of a single mode of thought, and disciplined the European mind. And he also had wonderful things to say about Christ as a figure. He said, Nietzsche believed that the only true Christian was Christ, and his criticism was essentially saved for the dogmatic structure of the church. Now, I actually have more sympathy for Dostoevsky, who I think thought more deeply about this than Nietzsche, which is quite a frightening thing to say because Nietzsche is such a deep thinker. But, in the Grand Inquisitor, when Christ comes back to earth and is then arrested by by the Grand Inquisitor of Seville during the Spanish Inquisition, the Grand Inquisitor takes Christ into the cell and tells him why it's necessary for him to be put to death again. He says, the church has worked diligently to humanize the impossible load that you've placed on people, and to make it bearable for the common man. And the last thing we need is someone as perfect as you and terrifying as a consequence, as a judge, because something that perfect as a judge coming back to mess up all our work. And, that's a sympathetic portrayal of Catholicism, I would say, or maybe Orthodox Christianity as well, that it had that merciful element that the demand for perfection was antithetical to. But then, of course, Dostoevsky has the brilliance to, when the Grand Inquisitor leaves, hypothetically having sentenced Christ to death, he leaves the door open. And I've often thought that that's so true of Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity, Protestantism as well, is that for all their faults and for all the faults that people like Nietzsche and Hitchens and Dawkins, etc., lay at the feet of these traditions, they at least did preserve the tradition and leave the door open. And that's not an easy thing to do over the course of centuries. I think the institutions deserve a certain amount of sympathy, even though I'm very concerned that they're degenerating and disintegrating in a manner that doesn't look easily forestallable.
Let me ask you a quick question about the Brothers Karamazov, because, twice in my life I tried to read it, and I think I just got bogged down with the Russian name stuff. So I failed both times. I got a little further the second time. But then just about 6 months ago, I got an audio of it, because I'm in the car all the time in California. I'm going back and forth. And I'm just about finished with it. I love it. It finally it sang to me as this guy read the thing,
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing how powerful it is on audio.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Wonderful. Mm-hmm. How do you read, first of all, the silence of Christ in the presence of the Inquisitor, but then secondly, the kiss on the lips at the end? So he sits in silence as this great accusation is read, but then kisses him full on the lips at the end.
Well, I think he accepts the accusation. Like, one of the things Jung said about Christ in the Gospels, which I thought was indescribably brilliant, was that Christ, not entirely, but is presented as a figure of mercy. Mm-hmm. And Jung was wise enough to know that, and he used religious sources for this idea, that God rules with two hands, with mercy and with justice, because if it's just mercy, then, well, all is always forgiven and you have no responsibility and you're an eternal infant. But if it's all justice, then look out, because every single transgression you commit, you'll be held to account for in some infinite manner. And people are so fallible that, well, you kind of see that happening on Twitter now. If you make a mistake of any sort at any point in your life, you're roasted over the open coals for it, and no one can stand that because everyone makes mistakes. And so there has to be this balance between mercy and justice. And Jung regarded Christ's return in Revelation as psychologically necessary, because any figure of perfection has this element of the judge, because any ideal is a judge. Yeah. And so
you can't bracket that in the name of because the master category is love, right? And not to be sentimental about it. Love means to will the good of the other. So that always has a judgmental dimension.
Of course it does, because if you have a child or a friend or yourself, it's like, and I felt this when I was a psychotherapist, practicing as a psychotherapist. I mean, Rogers said, well, you had to have unconditional love for your client. And I thought, no, I have unconditional positive regard for the part of my client that's striving toward the light. And I am a co-enemy with that part against the part that's trying to drag that person down. And
can I tell you that an entire generation of Catholic priests was formed under the Rogerian assumption, because that's what my generation got. Now, I learned things from Rogers, and the whole, it works in a way. When I was doing pastoral ministry and counseling early on as a young priest, that whole idea of just kind of mirroring back to someone what they're saying and giving them I get it. But I agree with you. There's a severe danger in that. If that's all we're doing with people, we're not moving them in the manner of a spiritual teacher. I had a student years ago who said to me, what we're missing from the church is Yoda on our shoulders. He meant Yoda on the shoulders of Luke Skywalker, instructing him and pressing him and telling him what he's doing wrong and how to get going. That we were all Rogerians. We just were unconditionally positive regarding everybody, but we weren't.
Well, it's a great compliment. See, the other thing that's made me popular among young people, this is so perverse. I have a hard time believing any of it, really. I mean, the first thing that I have a hard time believing is that, I can attract audiences of 5,000 people and tell them that the problem with their lives is that they're not bearing nearly enough responsibility, and that's where they're going to find the meaning that sustains them. Yeah. It's a pretty rough message. Yeah. And the second thing is, especially with young people, because the message has been for 50 years, and this is part of the humanists from the 1960s, is, well, you're okay the way you are. Yeah. And I think there isn't anything more damning that you can tell a young person than, well, you're okay the way you are, especially if they're suffering and nihilistic.
Right.
It's like, well,
It's
you're
like,
okay.
get me out of where I am. I want to get out of this state.
That's right. They want to crawl right out of their skin. And so you tell them instead, no, look, man, you don't know anything. You're barely beginning. You're suffering because, in a sense, because you are steeped in sin to an almost unimaginable degree. And I'm saying that compassionately, not judgmentally, and that if you want to put your life together, you have to start small and you have to be careful and awake. And if you do it carefully, then you can eliminate these flaws in your character that no one should be celebrating.